All right. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna start. Okay. I'm gonna start with a land acknowledgement. I'm here in Santa Fe. The place we call Santa Fe is recognized and known as Ogapoge, meaning white shell water place. This is the land of the northern and southern Tiwa, often identified as Tanos. We recognize that this land is one piece of a larger boundless terrain for indigenous peoples, the Nabe Pueblo, the Tiwa, and the Hakaria Apache, and the Diné, Navajo, Cochiti, Taos, and Hopi Pueblos. My name is David Sank. I'm the exhibition specialist for SciArt Santa Fe and New Mexico STEAM at the College of Fine Arts at the University of New Mexico. And I'm here at our exhibition at the Santa Fe Art Institute. At our the name of the exhibition is InPlace, Future Artifacts and Remembrance on El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. The show encourages dialogue on the relationships of art and science to monuments and other historical artifacts and representation through the lens of land use, colonization, climate change, extractive industries, and community. SciArt Santa Fe is a 501c3 nonprofit that serves community members interested in art science, highlights the long history and rich presence of art science within Santa Fe, and helps to further Santa Fe's role as an international hub for art science. This presentation is made possible with the generous support of the Department of Cultural Affairs, the National Endowment for the Arts, New Mexico Arts. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of our funders. We want to thank our presenting sponsors, Santa Fe Art Institute, Laser, Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous as part of Leonardo Art Journal. Leonardo fosters transformation at the nexus of art, science, and technology because complex problems require creative solutions. We are now streaming on YouTube. Our channel is SciArt Santa Fe, so if you miss any of our programs, you can see them on our channel. I want to introduce Heidi Brandow and Diego Medina. Heidi Brandow is a multidisciplinary artist whose work is centered on the inclusion of Indigenous people and perspectives in the development of ethical and sustainable methods of creative engagement. She is also the co-founder of Harvard Indigenous Design Collective. I'd like to welcome Diego and Heidi to this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, David, and thanks, Andrea and Amy and your team for Bianca, especially, who's not with us this evening, for organizing and creating this exhibition that I'm really grateful to be a part of. My name is Heidi, as David had mentioned, and I'm Diné and Kanaka Maoli. I reside in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and for those that this is going to be a really casual format conversation. Really grateful to have Diego with me, and I'm going to give Diego just a little bit of time to introduce himself and share, whatever it is you want to share as an intro.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heidi. And thank you, David, Andrea, Amy, everyone. This is fun. So like everyone has said so far, my name is Diego Medina. I'm a full-time artist, but I'm also currently serving as our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Piro-Manso Tiwa tribe. So I'm a member of the Piro-Manso Tiwa tribe of Las Cruces, New Mexico, and my mother's family is also Irish. So I have connections across the ocean as well. And my art and my cultural practice are pretty different in many ways, and I think it's cool to have these kind of conversations where we get to bring up a lot of really important historical data points to look at and figure out some of the nuanced and complicated histories here in the landscape, and then of course talk about art as well and how art kind of transcends that and informs that in various ways. So thank you, Heidi, for inviting me to be a part of this, and thank you everyone for hosting this.
Sure. Thank you. So let me see. I'm going to share my screen, and we've got this really brief PowerPoint just to orient, some of the work that's in the exhibition as we get into our discussion. Let me just share my screen. There we go. All right. So my practice is primarily in painting and social engagement work. This is just an example of some of the work I do, which is, a lot of acrylic painting. It's a mixed media process of like printed work and acrylic, graphite, a lot of stuff that's like layered information, but generally very like bright collage work that's very much like has a ton of like pattern work involved. So aside from that, a lot of the other projects that I've done in terms of social engagement include I've done a lot of work overseas, primarily in Turkey, and working with like refugee populations right at the beginning of the Syrian crisis and over the years, and then eventually moving into working with recycling collectors, primarily based in Istanbul, which is also a population that's comprised of individuals who are also refugees, but also just a very like layered and complicated story because of course it involves those that are involved in the collection process, but also it very much touches upon our consumption as human beings and sort of the effects of that in that field, but also environmentally and so forth. So this is kind of an ongoing thing, and of course it's been on pause mostly because of the pandemic. Oops, sorry about that. And then, so the work that you'll see in the exhibition is a result of a fellowship that I received a few years ago, Story Maps, which the cohort that I was a part of was in 2018. And essentially, we as artists were partnered with municipal departments within the city of Santa Fe. And we were tasked with developing creative projects based on our relationship and work experience with these municipal departments. I think that the project or story maps changed, like their sort of mission maybe probably evolved once our cohort was finished. But at the time, I was working with the waste or the city parks in Santa Fe. And so initially, like I did a ton of field stuff because I really had no idea how whatever I was doing was gonna like create this like creative project. So I worked with like at the time they had, and I don't know if it still exists, I've had a feeling that it might be on the outs, but the city's entomologist, which was really fascinating, went out in the field and like worked with the city parks crew, and eventually landed on this kind of basically auditing the memorials that exist within the city park system. So upon doing that, it really kind of, my interest in sort of looking at the memorials that are in the city park system, of course, I was really interested to find out like what Native people were represented, how many were represented, what stories, what memories were being represented in a public setting, and how did that look in proportion to non-Native histories or stories, and then going further and looking at sort of the colonial stories and histories, and how are all of these stories being represented in our public setting, and also beyond that, like also looking at like the portion of women and like looking at genders and how those stories were being represented and who's getting the funding, like how are artists selected for these types of projects. Also really then getting curious about like, well, where are these monuments situated and so forth. So for me, it really actually went back to, just a real like genuine curiosity of whose stories are being represented and how is memory playing out in the public space, right? And so as Diego had mentioned, and I'm fairly certain that, probably all of everyone in this audience and those on the panel are familiar with the context of how layered the history is in the state of New Mexico. And I think in a lot of ways, it really kind of separates us apart from the rest of the country in a lot of different ways. And I think especially like in northern New Mexico, a lot of those like histories sort of like blend in with one another. So on one hand, we have, of course, like our Native population all throughout the state. And then we have, sort of this influx and historical relationship with Anglo or those American settlers that were coming from the East, settling here. And then we have our Spanish, Mexican, and Hispanic relatives as well. Also like our Genízaro relatives in the north and throughout the state. So there's a lot of this history is very complicated and nuanced, but also, this process of auditing what stories and memories are being memorialized throughout the city park system. I think understanding that and recognizing it becomes all that more important to make sure that, there's some visibility of all of these different layers that are involved in who we are as, in the state of New Mexico. So part of this process, basically it kind of fed into this larger project, which eventually became the Memory Project. So beyond, sort of taking all of this data and breaking it down, we then, I then like moved into sort of, well, okay, so now I have this like statistical data representing all of these questions that we can then plot on a map and understand, like in a black and white terms, if you will, of who is and who isn't represented throughout the city. And then turning that back onto the public and engaging with the public in interviews and allowing them to then share if they had an opportunity to contribute or create a monument within our city, what would that be and what would that look like? So then there was a series, the project led into a series of interviews with a variety of individuals, some of whom are pictured here on this page, who contributed stories, and then I plotted all of their perspectives onto other maps. So as an example, I don't have all of the maps in this just because I figured if you are interested in, if you are within, in Santa Fe, there's still time to go check out the exhibition in public or on Fridays at the Santa Fe Art Institute. I think it's like in the afternoon, but I'm sure David can share that at the end. But just to give some sort of insight, some of the maps that I came up with were sort of measuring the density of genders represented within the city. Of course, the majority of memorials are dedicated to men, with a higher density of those memorials being sort of centered in the middle or near the plaza or the north side of town, if you will. It's an interesting distinction just because, for those that are not familiar, of course, with Santa Fe, the plaza or the north side of town has experienced a ton of gentrification over the last 20, 30 years, 40 years. And so there's a lot of displacement of families that have been there for generations, native and non-native. And so a lot of new money, if you will, goes towards that side of town. And there's also this ongoing commitment on behalf of the city to sort of uplift this facade of Pueblo revivalist architecture and style, to sort of feed into this myth of who we are, if you will, as a city. And then, as I was mentioning, the density of memorials is primarily found in the north side or near the plaza. And let's see. Here's another one. And then, of course, I sort of mapped out, what colonial influence was being represented within the monument system. 80% of which is 80% of the memorials are dedicated primarily to colonial history, whereas only 4 of the 65 memorials within the city of Santa Fe park system, at least, had some relationship to Native people. Can we see that next screen? Oh, here we go. So as I had mentioned earlier, I had done all these little interviews with people within Santa Fe and started plotting, what they would, what they would envision a memorial could be, or what they would like to see in Santa Fe. And this particular, these 2 images were then published in the Reporter in 2018 as part of a larger story. Gregorio Gonzalez is from the Hinistaro community of Rancho de Taos, and is a scholar and has done some work at the School of Advanced Research and many other places, but contributed this beautiful piece on sort of memorializing, if you will, kind of this, Santa Fe as being a site of international indigenous diplomacy. Then of course, Catherine Harris Tijerina, she wanted to talk about or envision a memorial that talked about the slave trade and Santa Fe being a nexus of that trade. James Rutherford contributed a sort of an unconventional memorial, if you will, in that James thought that it would be interesting if there was a garden that was dedicated to beans, corn, and squash, just to sort of mark the relationship of those plants and to this region and to the people that have been settling here. Graciela on the end, her family has been here for several generations, and they have experienced firsthand, this issue of gentrification on the north side of Santa Fe near Atalaya. And so her thought was, to talk about and to really think about memorializing her family's relationship to that place and this loss. That was one thing that was really I was taken, was just this real true sincerity and on one hand, I think the general public is willing to participate in this process of re-envisioning memorial. On the other hand, it's very personal and touching, and it's unfortunate to see how things have kind of unfolded over the last few years in terms of how discussions around memorials in Santa Fe have gone, because I think when you really are able to have these sort of like one-to-ones or very like close conversations with the general public on these issues, I think it's really sincere. I don't know, I'm not able to really express how genuine those conversations feel, but I would hope that we can get to a better place publicly and as a community in terms of like having these really important discussions, because ultimately, whether it's really about building another memorial or reconsidering current memorials, I think at the very least, like sharing these stories of our shared and collective history together is really important. And so, whoops, sorry about that. So that's kind of it on my side in terms of like a formal presentation. I thought that we could then shift a little bit to having a conversation. And Diego, I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about the work that you've done on the topic. And by the way, I mean, Diego is a super accomplished artist, and I'm going to share a link to a podcast that they worked on while you're talking. So
wonderful. That was a really cool presentation. Yeah, your work's always so fascinating, Heidi. And I think for me, I'm such a metaphor brained person that I'm always thinking of all these different transcendent metaphors that come about when talking through issues of map making and history and the intersections there. The work I do. So like I said briefly in my intro, I'm an artist primarily, and my art, funny enough, is pretty fantasy oriented. I do a lot of illustration work, and I use time in a way in my artwork that is informed by my history practice as well as a Tepo. And so one thing that really informs both sides of my work a lot is this notion that ancestral sites weren't meant to be ancestral. And I think when we look at memorials, they're intended to be transfixed to a kind of period in time that's meant to stabilize history. But as we know, history doesn't really stabilize itself well because it's always informed by its past and its future, right? It's not disconnected from its timeline in a way that allows it to be unmovable. And I think that's why we're contending with a lot of issues of history now, because obviously as time goes on, values change. One thing that I'm working on down here in Las Cruces as Tepo is, of course, issues in monument names, right? Oh, we have a few mountains down here that are named after Confederate soldiers, or named after. We even have, I think it's the only public place in New Mexico where we have like the SQUAW word on like a monument down here in Las Cruces, and we're working on getting that changed as well. And a lot of the conversations around renaming sites are really interesting, because what we're looking at is isolating one particular era of time and addressing that era of time in the grand scheme of things. And I liken it to looking at geological strata a lot of the times. Like when we're driving through New Mexico, there's a lot of sites where there's some really beautiful geological strata, and you kind of see these like caked layers of time. And these are really a cool calendrical use of geology that the Earth has done, I think, because we can kind of look to the rock layers and the sediment layers and understand what the Earth was going through at that time. And it's a very tactile way of understanding how nature preserves its stories. And when we look at monuments and memorials, it's not dissimilar to the same practice, except it's not often understood within the entire strata of the story. And that's the main difference, I think, when we're understanding natural time versus memorialized time, is that memorialized time has that stagnancy to it. And I recently did a mural in Albuquerque at 516 Arts, looking at, of course, the Camino Real. And our tribe's history of the Camino Real is pretty multi-layered, because it encompasses all of the different eras of the story that the route has to tell. Of course, we know it was one of the oldest indigenous migrational and trade highways in the continent. And then, of course, it became a slave trade route, a glorified slave trade route during the Spanish colonial era. And then now it's a highway. And so obviously there's more within that, but the three main layers of time or stories told in the timeline of the Camino Real fall into one of those three eras. And as a person living now, it's really interesting to like understand the connection to all of those different periods of time and how they're all understood and present and felt within the body in a particular way. And so when I painted the mural, what I wanted to look at is how using the metaphor of geological strata could help us understand the more abstruse histories of these sites and these places of significance, and how to kind of reconcile issues relating to controversial histories by understanding how time is preserved in nature, and how the geological record is kind of this arbiter of natural time. So yeah, here's an image of that mural, and what I did is I used of course the figures on the right. I kind of wove them together with these just caked layers of color to signify this stratified embodiment within the present. And I think for me, one aspect of time that's always really interesting is its convergence, and it's in particular timelines and how they converge. And so, like I mentioned in my intro, my father's side of the family is from here in Las Cruces and other parts of New Mexico, and we've been here for 20,000+ years, right? And then my mother's side of the family is from Ireland, and I think about a significant moment in New Mexico history that's that really impacted our tribe, right? So I think like the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, right? And then I think about what was happening in Ireland in 1680, and while those two moments in time may be unrelated, whatever is happening. So say like Pueblo Revolt's happening here, and then 1680 something's happening in Ireland. While those two things are unrelated, they kind of they converge in my story. And so in a sense, those timelines come together and those stories become related in the present. And that's how geological strata kind of works, where one layer of sediment is completely unrelated to the top. Like if you look at like the bottom layer of rock, it's completely unrelated to the top layer of rock, but yet they're all part of the same mountain face. And so memorials have this attempt to transfix history to one particular era without considering the greater scope of what's going on in the region. And so when I did that mural, it was really about how in the present we have to contend with all of these different layers of time, and how they're all part of our story in a way. And it was a different piece than my other more illustrative works, because I used obviously a more abstract approach, but it was also a very, very historically dense mural. On the left-hand side of the mural, I had those footprints, and those have a dual reference as well. So as Tepo, one of the other projects I've been working on recently is of course the White Sands footprint site, right? And we know that now the oldest archaeological site in the continental United States is right here at White Sands, which is about 30, 45 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. And it completely upended a lot of what we understood about the history of the continent, the peopling of the Americas, and a lot of other things that science had gotten wrong. And I think it's an interesting type of memorial because um, it's not a memorial to history, right? It's in and of itself a memorial that is history. And I think that for me, it was such a profound experience to be out at that footprint site at White Sands and see the footprints that are 23,000+ years old and kind of understand how that's related to me here in the present. And when I was there, I was really curious how they dated those footprints. And when I was there, I learned that the dating process was done by carbon dating the seeds that were preserved in the footprints. And so during the time when the footprints are pressed into the ground, there's a lot of plant material. And over time, the cellulose matter decayed, but the seeds remained. So there's these tiny little seeds pressed into the footprints, and they're able to take those seeds and date them. And I thought about how what remained through time were the seeds and the prints, right? And I think having a metaphor brain, I was like, wow, that's so cool. I don't know why yet, but it just makes so much sense to have just seeds and footprints of all that remains from that era, and yet you can get the entire story. And so I put the footprints in this piece for one to reference obviously the travel along the Camino Real and what would have been left on the trail itself, because the trail itself is nothing without the presence of the usage of the trail, right? I mean, what makes it a trail is that it's been used and people have left their footprints on it. And so there's the reference to the footprints of the Camino Real itself, but then also this reference to the oldest footprint site in the Americas and how what someone leaves behind, that's not necessarily part of their being, but it's part of their lived experience, is how we know the true history of this region. And so I think that when understanding memorial and monuments and historical sites and so on and so forth, to me, I think it was really fascinating to compare the footprints to other things like petroglyphs and intentional sites of ceremony, because petroglyphs and footprints and things of similar presence, they're not parts of our physical bodies, but they are extensions of our life. And I think that's a really important way to look at how we understand time beyond its brevity, because obviously linear time is a very complex thing in and of itself, and then when we get beyond linear time, it gets even more complex. But understanding that these things that are left behind aren't meant to be historicized, they're meant to be transcended in a way. And so when our ancestors were leaving petroglyphs at various sites, it wasn't so that they would be historical, it was that so they would be used for the future. And even though a lot of these sites are considered historical sites or ancestral sites, they are in a way monuments more to the future than they are to the past, because they allow the prosperity of people to carry forward and carry on. And so this transcendence of time was something that I'm really, really fascinated with. And it's something that is the key overlap in both my art practice and my cultural practice. And I think that understanding merging timelines, understanding transcendent timelines, and understanding stratified timelines is really key to understanding everything that we consider a monument or a memorial. Because when we transfix time, we kind of extract it and take it out of the timeline, which of course is a very inaccurate way of understanding its impact. And so it's an extractive practice to try and memorialize time because it doesn't consider those that came before or those that came after, or those that come after. And that's really the key for true monuments. And so I I'm really grateful that Heidi is here talking about all this stuff, because these are all topics that are personally to me so fascinating and so significant to New Mexico, especially with understanding our relationship to certain places, right? Because even the Camino Real, like, one part of me has a very sacred relationship to it. And then another part of me is like, yeah, definitely our tribe was taken down as slaves on this route, right? And so it's definitely a harsher history. And it's the same site, yet the meaning changed by its usage. And so what was left behind, be it footprints or be it intentions, is what makes it what it is and how we understand it. I think I'll toss it back over to Heidi because I know she'll have some things to say on that. But that's kind of a brief introduction to some of my work recently. And I have a lot of other things that I'm working on, but I want to make sure for time's sake that we have a lot of time for other questions and comments to bring up. But yeah, thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to also, I mean, I guess we can just sort of get into a conversation. I know there's been a few comments in the chat, but really briefly, I just wanted to mention that I really love how you talk about like the transcendence of these imprints and petroglyphs, if you will, and how, you know, like perhaps, like I really like this idea that like those footprints, for example, were more like a roadmap into the future, or like a pathway, you know, to like prosperity, if you will, or, you know, it's like a guide, if, you know, and just like, it made me think about, you know, when I was working on this project, especially like in conversations with other Native people, in particular, Porter Swensel, who is a Santa Clara Pueblo scholar and like just all around like amazing person. But you know, we talked about like how this idea of memorializing and memorial building is in a lot of ways very much like not a part of our way of being, like that the way that we understand memorials today is very much in line with sort of this like Greek form of like idolization and like individualization, and how, you know, we just didn't necessarily have the same process, you know, in a lot of indigenous communities. And I think it also kind of like leads into what you were talking about, right? Which is how, you know, when you look at sort of like those footprints and the petroglyphs, and how there's this transcendence that exists, and perhaps, you know, we're kind of looking at this idea or this topic of memory and memorialization, and maybe not necessarily like the wrong way, but a very like just not a very like sophisticated way, you know. So with that said, I mean, one of the things that I saw in the chat and earlier was, it said, and I think this goes back to like how I mentioned, you know, that it's a bit of a shame that our publics are like our general public isn't able to engage in these conversations with one another and sort of share stories and histories and so forth in more productive ways. There was a comment saying many in our community don't often have those opportunities to have personal dialogue about these topics with Santa Fe various community members. And I agree. I think that there's perhaps not a lot of opportunities, especially, for those to sort of intermingle, if you will, across economic divides. And I think that's also where the role of the artist comes in. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, artists are able to sort of transcend those boundaries and those barriers, and to create those opportunities for dialogue and understanding. And so with that said, I mean, I think like it's really critical to continue to support the work of artists in this, like, and not only in the field of like memory and memorials, but broadly, because there's this trust factor involved, right? And also something that I think most artists like respect and hold dear is that trust that's implied in relationships with community. So Diego also did a ton of work similarly in sort of engaging with the public. And I don't know if you want to share a bit on that and comment on this comment.
Yeah, I think the role of artists through time, at least the consistent role, has been it's translation work, really, right? Whether it's spiritual translation work, cultural translation work, political translation work, so on and so forth. Artists were translators of various forms, right? And so I think that when it comes to art's place in community engagement, it's really about effective translation of the needs of the community that the art's representing, or the voice or the opinions, the identity, whatever it is, maybe not just needs, but to be a translator on behalf of another. And I think that there's definitely different ways every artist can approach that work. But when it comes to community engagement, there is this real barrier between the civic structures and then the public. And I think that artists kind of being intermediaries between their communities and sometimes those who are directly harming their communities, it's interesting work because you're kind of taking on this role of like a messenger, an emissary of some sort. It's like you're running back and forth. It's like, hey, here's a message from this side. Now let's run it back and give the message to that side. And so I think to really do that effectively, you have to kind of understand and be understood by both sides of the conversation. And so when I was a Story Maps fellow, it was during the pandemic. So we didn't do the same amount of, not that the pandemic's over, but it was during the lockdown part of the pandemic. And so we didn't have the same amount of physical engagement as other Story Maps fellows have had. We didn't go door to door or like hang out and collaborate with people in person. We actually really didn't know what the heck we were doing at first because we had to try to find ways to be engaging with the community without actually physically engaging with the community. And I think that maps are a key component to that work. I mean, not only is it a literal Story Maps fellowship, but also maps themselves are these translational guides towards understanding or ascension, mobility, whatever it is. And maps have always played that kind of powerful role. And so I think that in a way, maps and art have always had a shared root, a shared creative ancestor, because art is a kind of map towards meaning. And then, of course, maps through time have always had an artistic component to it. They've never been disconnected from one another. And so any type of map we see across cultures and across times, they're art pieces. And some of the oldest art pieces we study are maps, right? A lot of our petroglyphs are maps. A lot of mandalas are maps. And there's a lot of different usages of cartographical practices that are, of course, inherently artistic. And then vice versa is true as well. A lot of art pieces are in some form or another a map. And so I think that for me, it was a really cool moment to step into a deeper relationship with cartography, and how effective of a tool cartography is for really anything. I mean, you can make a map for how you want to, what you want to accomplish for your day, right? You can make a map for anything. And making a map that represents the concerns of the community is a pretty effective approach for community engagement. And I think I've always been fascinated with maps, because they're kind of these, and this just goes back to my fondness of fantasy. I think they're just kind of really cool. Like, I mean, some of the oldest like medieval maps and stuff, of course, were like these, they were all based in treasure magic, right? And this notion that there's like treasure out there that we gotta find. And so there's literally diviners and esotericists and all studiers of the arcane, like coming together, like, all right, how are we gonna find this treasure? And how are we, and how are we gonna make sure that we make a map to where other people can find it, but not too easy. We don't want them to find it too easy. We want to make sure that they have to work for it. And so this culture of map making that exists globally is kind of a fun phenomena of the human experience, because it's something that we do unique as a species, among other things, that really doesn't it's something so indescribably profound to do. Like, even if it's a map to find your way home or whatever, like even a very straightforward map like that, it's something that's beyond our instinctual reality, and it goes into our theoretical reality in a bit of a way. So for me, I'm like, my fascination with map making starts with like the culture of treasure magic, for sure, and this idea that like you can make a map to find or accomplish anything, right? It's like, if there's treasure out there, well, by Jove, we'll make a map and we'll find it. And it changes over time. And so now we can look at like, okay, if there's a problem with the community representation, and we need to translate that problem to those people who are going to be the decision makers, well then, by Jove, let's make a map for them. And so of course that's what Heidi's done with her cool maps, is find a way to translate a better reality for people who need to understand it. And that's kind of the goal of most maps, even if it's like a celestial map or a heavenly map. A lot of petroglyphs have a celestial cartographical component to them, and it's a way of, okay, like, how do we get these people to understand what our cultural values are in relationship to the cosmos? It's like, I don't know, we'll find a cool way to draw it and we'll put it on a rock, and that way they'll understand how to get there. And now we can kind of use that same ancestral practice, that real sapient part of our experience here, and leverage it to really benefit communities that need it in an effective way. And I know I got a little tangential because I got really, really enthusiastic about the notion of treasure, so I might have gotten a little off point at somewhere along the lines. But I think treasure in and of itself is an inherently human thing to seek, whether it's actual riches or whether it's like the treasure of equality, or let's see, what's can information or understanding be a treasure? Absolutely. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here, is that we're still kind of making maps towards what is desired. And whether it's like, some people, like, there's still probably kids out there making treasure maps. I actually, when I started our story maps fellowship, I think we literally even made a treasure map, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's still this usefulness of understanding how these allegories of treasure are actually very, very relevant to um, our practical community, because treasure is the metaphor for abundance, right? And abundance is obviously what is divinely promised people. And I think that when politics get in the way, that's when things get uh, withheld from people. And so making these maps to represent the community voices, or the or those who aren't represented, um, is in and of itself a map towards a future of treasure. And um, I think this is so cool that we're getting to talk about treasure right now. But I think it's really, really important to kind of, understand that there's always going to be a um, a kind of um, mystical component to any map that's made, right? Because any map that's made is and has an abstract element to it, but it's also kind of like partly in reality, partly not in reality, kind of like really quintessential to the mystical experience, right? Part in reality, part outside of reality. And even a map that represents community, or the needs of community, there's that element of, okay, here's the reality part of the map, and then here's the part of the map that's beyond reality. And that's the part that I think is really, really significant to ensuring that what the map is seeking um, is found. And so to answer the question that was originally stated, I think that it was somewhere along the lines of like my work with community. And I think that as a Story Maps fellow, what we ended up doing, even with the podcast work and stuff, is kind of creating a lot of map templates, and showing the different types of maps that can be made towards understanding various issues a little bit better. And I kind of, want to throw out a question to Heidi in response to that, and ask kind of when it comes to the maps that take monuments and kind of create visual data to inform people about the representation dynamics, or the representation in a particular region. What part of that process, let me think of how to word this better. What part of that process do you feel like is most effective in really allowing people to understand the needs of the community? And so when you have these maps that are put together and they're kind of visually telling a story of misrepresentation in an area, what part of that process to you is the part of it that really brings it home for the community, if that makes sense?
I think so. I mean, I think that, like, at least what I gathered personally from like a community member standpoint, I would say that a lot of the thoughts that we have, like, is maybe the general like notions that our community shares with our perspectives that we share with one another, depending upon like what groups maybe that you're associated with, like your friendships, where you hang out at, what economic strata you're a part of, and so forth. Like, you have sort of this general idea of where you fit in the community, you know, but it's all generally informed by, you know, sort of the ongoing like conversations in those groups. And I think as a community member, like really finding the actual like data and then putting it together and seeing actually, you know, like, for me, that was the most like illuminating part, where it's like, okay, now we know for sure, like it's not just like so and so says this, or this is what I heard, and maybe it's better for some and worse for others, right? So like if you hang out downtown all the time, then you're able to engage with these memorials more often. So for you, maybe it's not a big deal if that's your scene. But if you're in the central or south side of town, then you're not engaging with it. And maybe you feel that, you know, and you feel that absence or that loss. So it really, like, I think the maps is the most effective thing, was just really like getting it out, like getting out all the sort of stories maybe that we kind of carry and that we sort of know but not really, and just having fact to paper, you know, like this is what it is, and now we can just like move forward with that, you know. And because really that's kind of what it's about. Really, it's not just like staying stuck in sort of these data points, but also like using those data points as an opportunity to like move the conversation forward, to sort of, you know, like build up, you know, where we can now identify where things could be more, a little stronger in terms of representation and accessibility. So now that we know, it's like, okay, well, now we can make it better.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess at the very least, like I don't want this project to be seen as like a fire starter necessarily, or something to sort of be a divisive tool, but really to just try to, you know, figure out where we stand and then how we can start like addressing those maybe disparities that might exist. Something that came up, which I think is kind of interesting, and Diego, you might have some more recent experience on this topic, is looking at how the Midtown campus, what role that plays, and how it's sort of like kind of just this like desert oasis in the middle of the city. And how that kind of is, you know, there's been so many like different proposals, and things have just kind of like fallen apart, and so there's this like big space, and it's kind of just in limbo, and what that role is in terms of like where we're at today in the city and so forth.
Yeah, you know, for me, when I was working on the Midtown campus and those conversations started coming up, what was most I guess present for me was this understanding that, you know, people kept saying it's like the heart of Santa Fe. It's in the heart of Santa Fe. And I think it's pretty telling when like the heart is empty. You know, like people don't know what to do with it. And I think it really speaks to the values that civic institutions, city governments and stuff really have when they can't figure out what to do with their heart, right? Like when you can't figure out what your heart needs and what to put in your heart, and you're sitting there with an empty heart, I think it speaks a lot to how the direction the city is going and how much work it really needs. And so, you know, when I was doing my residency there, one thing I really latched onto, both symbolically and also because I made a friend of it, was the purslane that was growing around the campus. Purslane is a plant that has so many powerful symbolic meanings. Even Pliny the Elder and historical figures similar spoke of how important of a medicine purslane was. And purslane's a plant that it grows radial, and so it kind of um, circles and spirals outward as it grows. And I took that as a really um, appropriate metaphor for the process of prayer, and how when you pray, what you're doing is placing something in your center and allowing it to radiate out. And I think that it was there for a reason, kind of diagnostically, to say what was wrong with the Midtown campus, is that there is no prayerful intention placed there in the heart of Santa Fe to radiate outwards and impact the city in the way that it needs. And so for me, what the best approach towards Midtown would, of course, be kind of recalibrating how Santa Fe sees its heart, and using all of this information and data, right, to kind of inform the best appropriate decision making, but also making sure that it's done from a real reverent place of care for land and people and community, a real heart space. And so seeing the center of the city as a heart space is number one. That's important. And then understanding what you do with the heart space and how you utilize that to impact the rest of the community is number two. And I think the purslane there on campus was saying that so in so many ways, because it just had a real prominent presence there. And I also admire purslane because it teaches people how to be good community members. And I say that because purslane is a non-native plant. It was brought presumably unwillingly across into New Mexico from Europe. And yet what it did with that situation is that it found its place in the ecosystem, and it ended up offering its medicine back to the communities that it was welcomed into. And so I think that's a real important way of approaching one's role in a community, is to find the best way to offer your medicine back to the place that houses you. And Midtown is the place where that needs to be disseminated out into the community from. And so, yeah, all the talk about the Midtown campus and what to do with it, how to effectively use it and stuff, what it ultimately came down to, even though there's so many, I think they're probably just gonna, I don't know, lease out some of the buildings to like businesses or whatever. It's like, I could have told you that 2 years ago. That's what they were gonna do, right? Of course they're gonna lease it out. But I think to what businesses is really key, or what organizations, or what, I actually don't know what they're doing with the campus. I just assumed that, the last I heard was that leasing it out was an option. But I think that, it's a real important opportunity to look at the heart of Santa Fe and figure out, okay, this is a testament to how neglected, how much neglect has taken place in Santa Fe. And I think a lot of the institutions that have tried to take root there have also had to confront that as well. I mean, we had multiple colleges there at the site that fell through for one reason or another. And I think that's because the heart of the issue is still not being addressed, literally. And it's that there's a lot of harm, and there's a lot of harm done in Santa Fe and a lot of neglect that took place that needs to be addressed and confronted. Let me see. There was a few questions that had popped up. Interesting to think that none of us know what's happening in our city's heart. Exactly. Yeah, I couldn't tell you. I was invited to be on that. I don't even know the name of the committee at this point, but I was just like not really into the weird bureaucracies of all of it. Interesting to think about hidden infrastructures and invisible systems that enable or disable access to areas with particular monuments and what they represent. Yeah, I mean, going back to the conversation about maps, I think all maps show hidden things, right? And I mean, at least like in my community, one of our cultural teachings is that, there's the seen reality and the unseen reality. Both of them are equally important. And I think that maps show the unseen. Maps are ways of finding what's hidden or finding the unseen. And especially saw the hidden in Heidi's data. Yeah, exactly. Like Heidi's maps show the unseen reality of these monuments and what they're actually saying. And I think that, yeah, the hidden realities are always at play in our lives. Whether they're, actual, interdimensional forces, or whether they're like, weird political, manipulations, right? Whatever it is, like there's these unseen forces that really impact people. And some of the unseen forces are things like, hey, yeah, 60% of these monuments don't actually reflect the demographics of the city, and that impacts the community, it impacts the youth, and it's a hidden reality. And having these maps to expose the hidden realities or to show people where the hidden things are is a very important process. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Heidi.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something you mentioned about like this community dialogue that you were invited to or a part of, or weren't able to attend. One of the things that it reminded me of is like the Santa Fe Chart Committee, which I put a link in the chat for those that might be interested. I don't know where that stands right now, but I know that like it was organized, I guess, by the city. And I think Kathleen Kawayama, she works for the city. She might be the director of like the city of Santa Fe, like art, I forget what the exact like title is or division, but it's essentially like this committee of community members who I think are engaging in conversations and dialogue surrounding, I think, a lot of the issues related to memorials and history. And so for those that might be interested in tapping into that, there's a link in the chat. I don't know where things are at right now. I think I was looking at their website and it looks like there was an open like application period and over 150 people applied. So there's definitely like a lot of interest among community members. So it'll be interesting to see where things are at. I'm not really sure where things are. But there's another question in the chat. It says, this is an earlier question from Andrea. What do you think needs to happen to create a more balanced representation of monuments in Santa Fe and New Mexico? I mean, I feel like it's such a complicated question. And I also was thinking too, like of other examples in other countries, like in Germany, for example, they've done a ton of work, especially after World War II, to sort of like re-envision, right, like what memorials were existing during the Nazi era. And then how then do you like handle those like public representations, but also like how then do you also acknowledge like this really violent recent history, right, that happened with in the region.
Yeah.
So they've done a ton of work. I don't think there's necessarily like a silver bullet to this question. But at the very least, I do think like artists play a significant role in sort of re-envisioning or in sort of sussing out kind of how we get to this solution. Because I don't think it necessarily is just all historians. I don't think it's just all HOAs or like, I don't know. It's just, I think there has to be a creative element. And I think artists play a significant role as perhaps like a conduit in those conversations.
Right. And I also think a big part of it is not just necessarily like what people are memorialized, but what values are memorialized. Because I think there's always going to be like somebody who feels like they're not adequately represented, right? Because you run into those issues as well when you try to like, you don't want to end up like tokenizing the the plaza and how like, oh, here's like a like a memorial to like a historical like Asian figure and then a historical Black figure inside of it, right? I mean, I think that if you go down the list, there's a lot of diversity in Santa Fe and a lot of other communities, and it when you have that, you run the risk of someone feeling like their story's not being told, which is obviously part of the issue to address, but also like I think looking at what values are being memorialized by the monuments or the people that are in the monuments is something else to look up. For example, in Las Cruces, the other day I had a conversation with the news station here about Baylor Canyon, which is the site named after a Confederate soldier. And Baylor is an absolute terrible person. I mean, the stuff he said was just atrocious. I'm not going to repeat it here, but I think some people felt like, because he shared the same identity ethnically as them, that like they were being taken out of, being represented here in the city. I'm like, it's not that at all. It's like, we're looking at this person's values, right? Like this, it's not just like who they were and what their background is. It's like, this person was objectively a bad person. Like if Baylor was, came here and did good things and, benefited the community, we wouldn't be having the same conversation. But he didn't. He had really bad values, and that's why he doesn't need to be memorialized in this space. And it has nothing necessarily to do with his objective identity. It's more about, why is this person being memorialized, and what narrative does that feed into, right? And I think that recalibrating the values of monuments would also end up correcting some of the misbalanced representational issues. Because obviously when you recalibrate the values of the community, you're going to have more people to represent in those narratives. And I think that's part of it as well. And so it's not just like, hey, let's find someone of a different ethnicity to throw up in this monument. It's like, no, let's really think about the values of the people we're trying to memorialize and how that is central to how to amend these past wrongs. Because if the values aren't what's addressed, then we'll end up just running into the same issue down the road where someone's going to have a problem with some representation or some memorial. And it's fine to have problems with things, but I think that if the community values are really well established, then it goes a lot longer, it goes a lot farther. Yeah, these questions are fun. Are there any other questions? Let's see.
Well, I think that was a good discussion. I hope you all found it illuminating, and by all means, like, go check out the show at the Santa Fe Art Institute.
Yeah. Let's see, I think we got one more question, right?
Oh, I just wanted to mention our next laser as part of our series. It's in the show. So if you wanted to address the last question, that would be great.
How might you prevent one group's supremacy being replaced by another group's supremacy? How does one reach a spatial consensus of values based on shared futurity that respects the possibilities of ancestors and generations to come?
It's a great question. That's a really, really great question. And I think that's I think that's something that is a historical dilemma in a lot of ways, because you see it happening from time to time. I mean, I always think about the case of New Mexico itself, right? Like, I think obviously we can't look at New Mexico in a vacuum. Everything that happens in New Mexico history is attached to the history that comes before it. And there's some dense history to understanding New Mexico, and some, for example, like, to understand, the colonial era of New Mexico, we also have to understand the Spanish Inquisition, right? In the Spanish Inquisition, we have to understand, the Muslim caliphates of Spain. We have to understand, the so much stuff about what came before. And I think that, these historical narratives aren't separate from one another. And so, yeah, we have like the Spanish Inquisition, which happened, and all of the Muslims and Jews were being persecuted and killed in Spain. So a lot of them came over here to New Mexico, and then they end up, doing some colonizing here. And it's just like, gosh, this is a complex stuff. But yeah, it's like waves of colonization. And I think isolating events without their context is part of the problem. We can't just say like, okay, these people, group A came over here, did this thing to group B, because then we take away everything that has happened to group A before that, which of course opens up the possibility for another turn of imbalance. And so I think that, we really have to look at these histories holistically and understand them in the bigger picture first. That way we can really start to say, okay, all of this happened, we get it, like, it's bad stuff, let's stop it now. And I think for New Mexico's sake, how I'll answer this question is to say that I like to give the analogy of the Matachina dance. So the Matachina dance is a dance that arguably has Berber origins, right? Like, Amazigh people are indigenous to Northern Africa, and in, what was it, the 6th century, one of the caliphates of Spain was a Berber caliphate. And so he was indigenous North African. The Berbers were really prominent in Spain during that time. And obviously Muslims and Jews had an alliance because of Samuel Anagid, or whatever his name was, working for the Muslim caliphate. Anyways, at some point, this dance gets brought to Spain, and it's originally a dance about light overcoming dark, and it becomes a song about, or a dance about, overcoming one's oppressor. And so you have this dance which teaches this age-old story of light overcoming dark, now being used for political propaganda. And then when the Christians are like fed up and they're decide like, all right, we're gonna retaliate, and we're gonna kick out all of the Muslims from Spain or whatever, the Inquisitions happen. And then of course the Christians take this dance and turn it into the dance of the Moros y Cristianos, where it's now about the Christians overcoming the Moors. And then of course a lot of people come over here to New Mexico during that time, and they bring the dance with them here, and it gets taught to our indigenous communities. So now it's a dance about overcoming your oppressor, but it's about the Christians overcoming the Moors, but it's also about Catholicism prevailing. And it's a complicated thing to understand, but I think the dance itself is a perfect allegory for what this question is asking, which is like, why are there these cycles, and how do we stop them? And I think that what the problem is actually what the solution is. And so the dance itself has really good values. It's like, yeah, let's overcome what's bad in our communities. Let's kick out what's bad in our communities. But when they're not understood in the broader picture, it becomes only a one-sided narrative. It becomes, oh no, these people are bad, these people are good. And obviously that's not the case. And so I think that, from my perspective, making sure that there's a real broad scope of history understood, and that maybe I'll circle back and let Heidi jump in for now, because that's a pretty layered question. But it is a trend through history to have these like overturnings, and oftentimes it's because people don't know their history.
Yeah. Well, I think that you really like eloquently like answered or addressed the question. And I think it's one of those things, right? It's like there's no silver bullet. But I think you're right. I think it's just about going back to understanding our history. But I think just really quickly, like the thing that really complicates stuff, of course, now especially, is just kind of this attack, if you will, on what is considered to be critical race theory. But, in a lot of cases, it's not even critical race theory. It's just, these are the things that happened. And how do we even have these real, like, honest conversations if we're not even allowed to talk about it in the classroom, like K through 12 curriculum? So this is where we're at. And we're just, going backwards always in this. And that's it. So that's all I got. I mean, work with artists. Hopefully we'll figure it out together. But, here's to the future, I guess.
Yeah. I have a simple answer for the question. We make an effective map. That's what we do. We have to make a map to show people the way out of this cycle. So however that map's made is undetermined now, but we have to make a map.
So I'm going to share our next laser talk. Thank you very much for your contribution to the discussion relating back to our show InPlace, Future Artifacts and Remembrance on El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. Our next talk will be by UNM architecture professor Kate Bowles. And she's going to be having a similar conversation, but relating architectural structures as monuments, looking at them as monuments to non-humans. So when we're talking about non-humans, we're talking about ecosystems and down to the cellular level. So it's going to be quite an interesting conversation. She has a degrees in architecture, landscape architecture, biochemistry. So that's going to be our next talk on, it's actually at 6 p.m. Thursday, May 19th. So Heidi, Diego, again, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation and bringing a lot of these things that we're trying to bring these conversations, or creating this exhibition as a frame for these conversations to be had about monuments and memorials.
Thank you. Yeah, this was fun.
And I definitely like to talk to you more in depth at another time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Does anybody have anything else they want to say before we end? I guess not. Unless Heidi's talking, she's muted.
I'm good. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.